Hello, we're going to be in Galatians chapter 4 today. The first few verses I need to outline for you so you kind of see where we're going. In verses 1 through 11, Paul's going to pick up on the concept of heirs, that we are sons of God. It goes back to chapter 3, verse 7, verse 14, verse 24 through 26. He's going to develop that ideal in chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. Then in chapter 4, verses 12 through 20, he's going to develop a personal appeal, going back to how they accepted him and how they used to love him and what the false teachers. I've kind of called it Paul's heart. And then in verses 21 through 31, Paul goes into an allegorical interpretation of two of the sons of Abraham to kind of clinch his argument. And maybe the point is he's going to say the son of promise said, throw out the son of the slave woman. Now, of course, that was Sarah, not Isaac, that did that. But maybe he's going to try to say, you need to throw out these Judaizers, is maybe why he caps off his theological discussion here with this allegory. Let's go back to chapter 1, then, verse 1, chapter 4. I mean this, as long as the heir is under age, he is not a whit better off than a slave, although he is heir of all the property. Verse 2, but he is under guardians and trustees. Now, there's two places here. The first is the concept of heirship, that they are fully heirs when they know Jesus Christ. Apparently, the Judaizers have been saying you're not fully a son of Abraham until you follow the Mosaic law. And Paul's saying, no, you're fully heirs by faith through Jesus Christ. Now, earlier, just the latter part of chapter 3, particularly verses 23 and 24, we saw that the law was both a jailer and a child custodian. Well, here now, he kind of switches the terms around. It makes it guardians and trustees. And there is a background in the Greco-Roman world to these two concepts. And let me go through a little bit more as word by word, and we'll see. I mean this, as long as the heir is under age. Now, in Jewish society, a boy became a man at 13, bar mitzvah. In Greek society, a boy became a man at 18. In Roman society, the legal age was 14, although a father had some discretion into when he really let his son become a full man. It was a set day. It was every year on March 17th, this kind of a set day occurred for boys to become men, but a father had some leeway here. Okay? Now notice where it mentions then, he is not a whit better off than a slave, although he is heir of all the property. But he is under the guardians and trustees. Now this apparently is a Roman background. This first word guardian was used of someone like the pedagogical metaphor back up in chapter 24, a child custodian, and that was true in Roman life up till 14. And then after that, another kind of administrator of the child's property was appointed until the boy became 25 years old. Now, sometime after 14, the father had discretion of when they inherited the property, but that's kind of the legal background in Roman times. Now, notice where it says a time fixed by the father. Now, Paul's going to play on that in the next verse and said, God, the Father, fixed the time to send his Son. Because he sent his Son, you have become sons. That's the basic thrust here. Verse 3, so when we were spiritually under age, we were slaves to the world's crude notions. Now, this is the Greek word storkia. And there's been several different possibilities to understand the background of this term. It's used several times in the New Testament. It's used in Colossians 2, verses 8 and 20, Hebrews 5, verse 12, Hebrews 6, 1, and 2 Peter 3, 10 through 12. Now, the concept of this goes back to several aspects. Number one, this literally means in a row, something in a row. And so it's been used of the ABCs of something, or the kindergarten training, or the basic elements in teaching. And that seems to be the way it's used in Hebrews chapter 5:12 and 6:1. Some say that's the way it's used here in Galatians 4:3, and they would even quote Colossians 2:20 to back it up. But really, I think there's some other examples here. It's also used the basic building blocks of the universe. The Greek philosophers used to say that water and fire and air and those kind of things were the basic building blocks. Now that seems to be how it's used in 2 Peter 3, verses 10 and 12, that the elements are going to be destroyed in great heat, meaning the physical universe. But now there's two other usages we get, mostly from Jewish apocalyptic literature, and that is either spiritual forces, spiritual powers, gods with a little g, New Testament would call them demons, or these heavenly bodies like stars that were really the astral deities of the zodiac. Now, I think we see that pretty clearly in the New English Bible's translation of Galatians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9. I also think that's the background to Colossians 2:8. Now, it's possibly also the background to Colossians 2:18 through 20, because it mentions angels in that connection, and angels are mentioned earlier in Galatians 3:19, so maybe it's the idea of angels controlling men's destiny, and that may be true here. Some see this concept of heavenly bodies found in 1 Enoch 52, verses 8 and 9, and also in the early church fathers' interpretations of Colossians 2, verse 8. But I want to show you a book that I really like. This is Christ and the Powers by Hendrik Berkhoff. And this is a great book on what these powers mean. On page 32, he says this: I allude to this example solely because it makes so strikingly clear the sense of Paul's expression, not only his meaning but also his actual terms. Nor should it be difficult for us to perceive today in every realm of life these powers which unify man yet separate them from God. The state, politics, class, social struggle, national interest, public opinion, accepted morality, the ideals of decency, humanity, democracy. These give unity and direction to thousands of lives. Yet precisely by giving unity and direction, they separate these many lives from the true God. I think this guy has hit on it. I think these powers are demonic in a sense of the structures of man's society that unify man but make man sufficient. And what God wants is man dependent on him. I hope you'll get this book. I think it really throws a new light here. Now, notice then where it says, but when the proper time had come. Now, proper time how? Proper time in God's sense of time. It's the idea of God's in control of history. Now, some say it's the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, the Greek language, the expectation of the world. Many of those things may be true. Listen to the number of times in the New Testament a similar phrase is used. Mark 1:15, Ephesians 1:10, 1 Timothy 2:6, and Titus 1:3. Similar terms. Notice it says God sent. Now, God's going to send his Son here in verse 4, and then in verse 6, God sent the Spirit of his Son. Now, here's the whole Trinity, God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, all working together. Now, it's saying God sent. It's just like John 3:16. The word here is the word, the root for apostle. Matter of fact, in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1, Jesus is called an apostle. It's one sent with official authority. The fact that God sent him implies preexistence and deity in the whole bag. You might want to see John 1 and John 1:14. Now, notice where it mentions here, but when born of a woman. Now, what's this? Well, I think it's the idea that he's really a human being, as over against docetic Gnosticism, a later false teaching of 1 John. And there seems to be some idea of Gnostic flavors, even in the book of Galatians, though we see them more clearly in the book of Ephesians and Colossians, where they're a mixture of Jewish and Gnostic tendencies, and in the writings of John, where it's Gnostic alone, or this Greek background. Now, the other thing I think here is important, that it goes back to Genesis 3:15, that God's going to redeem man through woman. I also think the idea of Isaiah 7:14, God with us, Emmanuel, implies an incarnation, but man didn't understand that. This same phrase is used in Hebrews 2:14 and 17. You might want to see that. The concept of he came in the likeness of man, meaning he was really human, but he didn't have a sin nature, can be seen in Romans 8:3 and Philippians 2:7. Notice he was born subject to the law. You might see Romans 1:3. An example of this, him being subject to the law, or he was fully human and he was fully Jewish. Examples of that are in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 21 and 22 and 27, as he fully fulfilled the rabbinical understanding of the law in his day. Now, it says here's why he came. Why did God send him? He sent him to ransom those who were subject to the law. He became a curse for us, is the way chapter 3, verse 13 says it. Now look, the word ransom goes back to the word redeem, chapter 3, verse 13. He bought us back. He paid a price we couldn't pay. He took our place on the cross and gave us back his righteousness as a free gift. That's the idea. God sent his Son for the very purpose of being a Jew, for fulfilling prophecy, for dying in our place. You might want to see Mark 10:45. Now, for those who are subject to the law. Now, I think it's the Mosaic law here, but because we're talking to pagans, it is law in general. It's human effort. It's man's self-righteousness through his own merits. That's what's being condemned here. Now, so that we might be adopted as sons. Now here's the emphasis on heirs, fully heirs of Abraham. We already are. Now the word adopted is Paul's unique phrase for the idea of becoming a Christian, where John's unique phrase is being born again. Now in Roman adoption, it was very, very hard to adopt. You had to have 7 witnesses and several legal meetings. It was really tough. But once done, it was very, very binding, and I think that's why Paul uses it here. Notice in verse 6, it continues this metaphor. And because you are sons, God has sent His Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, that is, Father. And here again, if you've noticed already, I'm sure, this verses 1 through 11, or really 1 through 7, is very, very similar to Romans chapter 8, verses 1 through 17. Matter of fact, the idea of God sending His Son into our heart and all that, calling Him Abba, Father, that's Romans 8, 14 through 17. Now the concept here about we are sons and God sent the Spirit of His Son. Now this is the reference to the indwelling Holy Spirit. We've seen earlier in the book of Colossians, particularly back in chapter 3, where it said you received the Spirit. Did you begin in the Spirit? In chapter 2:14, particularly about we might receive the promised Spirit. All this implies this is the doctrine of the baptism of the Spirit, implying when you become a Christian, that Christ, the Spirit takes us and baptizes us into Christ. That seems to be the usage in 1 Corinthians 12, and the usage here. Getting the Spirit means you're saved. It's not two different acts. One's justification, later sanctification, but the idea of receiving the Spirit meant receiving Christ. That's the allusion here. Now the concept about the Spirit of Christ, called the Spirit of the Son, quite often the ministry of the Son and the Spirit are close together. If you remember John, chapters 14 through 16, the Spirit's going to lift up the Son, going to bring to mind the teachings of the Son, going to form the Son in us. You might also want to see Acts 16:7, Romans 8:9, 2 Corinthians 3:18, and Philippians 1:19 for other passages where the Holy Spirit is called the Spirit of Jesus, or similar phrases that links them very close together. Now notice it says Abba. Now Abba, of course, is Aramaic for daddy, the intimate terms a child would use for his father. You catch the background here on son and father. You know, we'll see Mark 14:36, and again, this word is mentioned in Romans 8:15. Now in verse 7, so you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir. There's the summary right there. By God's own act. This is very important. In the Greek manuscripts, there's a lot of variation of this last little dia theos. But it's very important. That's what it is. It's by God's grace, by God's initiation. It's God's plans, God's plan, God's effort, God's provision, God's Son, God's gospel. It's all through Him. It's all by grace. It's very similar to John chapter 6, verses 44 and 65, and you might want to see that. Now, notice if you would, where it mentions them, verse 8, but at the former time you did not know the true God, but you were slaves to gods that are really not gods. Now, this idea about us not knowing God goes back to Colossians 1:21, Ephesians 1:12. It's the idea we were estranged from God. Now, natural revelation says that we know something about God from nature, Romans 1:19 and 20. We also know something about God from an inner moral witness, Romans 2:14 and 15. So we weren't totally without knowledge as Gentiles, but we were estranged from God. That's the idea. The word know here is the intimate word for know, going back to Genesis 4:1, Adam knew Eve and she conceived. It's this Hebrew use of know as intimate relationship. And notice it says, you were slaves to gods that aren't really gods. You might want to see the idea of idols mentioned in Acts 17:29, or the fact that we went after those who were not gods, 1 Corinthians 8:4 and 5, or really Paul calls this, the demonic used this idol worship, 1 Corinthians 10:20, and it's implied in 1 Corinthians 12:2. Then it says, but now since you have come to know God, or rather have come to be known by God, aorist passive, you might want to see 1 Corinthians 8:3, Paul puts the emphasis back on God knowing us. It always comes from God, not from our side. That's very important. How can we turn back? This is the idea of a present active indicative. You'll see Colossians 2:20, turning back to legalism, turning back to rules, these earthly powers that control both Jew and Gentile. How can you do that, Paul says? They're weak and worthless, and you're going back into that again. And wish to become slaves to them again? Paul says, how can you do that? Trade paganism legalism for Judaism legalism. He can't believe they're going to do that. Verse 10, you are observing days. Now, it's present middle indicative. You are doing this. It means scrupulous observance here. This is the idea of Jewish feast days, obviously, and those kind of things. You might well see Colossians 2:16. I'm beginning to fear that I have bestowed my labors on you for nothing. Now, back in chapter 3, verse 4, it was emphasis on their experience being in vain. Here it's Paul's labor and experience being in vain. Look at verse 12. But I beg you, brothers, take my point of view. Now, there's several ideas here. Take my point of view toward the freedom in the gospel and the legalism of Judaism. Some say, I became like you so I might win some, 1 Corinthians 9, 20 through 22. Others say that Paul says, I was once a legalist and now I'm free, but you were once free, but now you've become a legalist. It's one of those three, and I'm not sure which. And you did me no injustice. Present middle imperative, I think, is very important there. It's emphasis on they treated him right. And yet you do not know that it was because of illness. Now this illness seems to be a thorn in the flesh, mentioned in 2 Corinthians 12, verses, I believe it's 7 through 10. You might want to see that. What is this thorn in the flesh? Well, I believe because of this idea about tearing out your eyes and giving them to me, and in chapter 6, verse 11, about see what large letters I'm writing you, I think Paul had oriental ophthalma. I think he got a problem when he saw the bright light in the road to Damascus. I think it got worse as he as he studied. He already had bad eyes, probably. The lamps of that day and the smoke in these rooms probably ate it. I think Paul was almost blind. That's why he needed someone with him like Titus or Timothy and said, come to me, It was very hard for him to get around. Not totally blind, but very blind. And apparently this oriental eye disease must have made his eyes protrude, because if you read this, it seems he looked repulsive. Even the literal Greek here is they spit when they saw him. Some say it's taken to the evil eye. Back in chapter 3, I didn't put the evil eye on you. Some say, well, look how ugly it is. Look at his eyes, how they stand out. Maybe he's got the evil eye. People used to spit so the evil eye wouldn't affect them. Maybe there's something of this in the background of all this. I'm just not sure. But it says, you accepted me as an angel of God, maybe a messenger of God, as Jesus himself almost. Wow, they really revered him. And I want to tell you, there's a simple truth here, not that, of course, that preachers are like Jesus, not that at all, but that they do have an authority from God. And if their message correlates with God's message, they ought to be revered as a spokesman for God. Now, notice it continues then in verse 17. These men are paying special attention to you. Yeah, they are, but Paul says just to get your attention. And in verse 18, it's kind of hard in verse 18 to know who is the subject. Is it the Judaizers who are being zealous? Is it Paul being zealous? Is it the Galatians being zealous? And the different English translations will show you how these varying interpretations have gone. Now, a little bit lower down in verse 19. Oh, my dear children, I am suffering a mother's pains for you again until Christ is formed in you. Now, in 1 Corinthians 4:15, Christ depicted himself as their father. Here he depicts himself as their mother. The idea here about until Christ is formed in you, it's the word morphe. You can see the play on this word between morphe, which is a permanent change, and schema, which is an outward transitory change, in Philippians 2, 6 through 8. We know this term was used in medical terminology for the development of an embryo. Maybe Paul's picking up on the life of Christ is now in you and developing. I think there is a sense, which you have to say, that we accept Christ, and then we're developed in him. Although, theologically speaking, we're both justified and sanctified when we're saved. But there is the process of sanctification in some verses, and this seems to apply to that truth. I wish that I could be with you right now and change my tone of speech. Paul's saying, I can't be there. If I was, I know we could sit down and talk about this, and the letter wouldn't seem so harsh to you. But Paul was really worried about these folks. Look what he says. I do not know which way to turn in your case. Now, the literal Greek here is the word for a way or a road with the alpha privilege. I don't know which way to turn. NEB says, I'm at my wit's end. Living Bible says, frankly, I don't know what to do. Philip says, I honestly don't know how to deal with you. You see Paul's frustration there as he deals with these folks. Now, in verses 21 through 31 is an allegory. I must admit, I feel real uncomfortable with allegory. I see the abuse of it in Philo at Alexandria, Egypt, and the Christian school that developed there with Clement and Origen. I see its bad use, and someone I admire so much is Augustine. And so I hold to the historical-grammatical method. But friends, I'm not inspired. And so it's really important for me to apply the logical messages of grammar to the Scriptures to understand the author's message. But Paul can go back and through inspiration, the fact he had special revelation from the Lord, pull some of these allegorical truths out, as Jesus did in the parable of the soil, say Matthew 13. But I don't have that level of inspiration. So as an interpreter, I'm nervous about any allegory or spiritualizing or typology that's not specifically taught by the authors of the New Testament, though I accept them as fully inspired. I've seen a great abuse of that in our day. A lot of preaching on the parables, a lot of preaching about the types in the temple. Friends, be careful of that, because you have no biblical authority when you get beyond the Bible. Even though they use the methodology, I think they have a different level of inspiration than, of course, we do. Now, really, this last little thing is very rabbinical. Now, why would Paul use a rabbinical? Well, it's in the same main thought about true heirs of Abraham. And I think it's very rabbinical because the Judaizers may have used similar allegories to these in trying to convince the Galatian Christians. So Paul kind of turns the tables on them and uses that which he's very trained in, and kind of he upsmanships them, if you want to please. Some say, well, it's used in the sense of the readers understood this and liked it. It was kind of a cultural form. And that's true. I really think when it says kick them out down there in verse 30, that's what Paul wanted to do, and this offered him a chance to say that. Tell me, you who want to be subject to the law, will you really listen to what the law says? Paul's saying, you Galatians who think you want to be in the law, listen to what the law says. And here he goes back to Abraham. Now, the reference here is Genesis 16 and Genesis 21. It's, of course, two of the many children of Abraham. It's after the promise came, initially in 12 and 15. Sarah said, Abraham, I'm too old. Why don't you just take my handmaiden and you can have an heir, and that'll fulfill God's promise. And Abraham did that, but it was Abraham's self-effort again, which we're trying to get away from. We're trying to get into God's grace, God's effort, God's provision, not man's effort, man's provision. So Ishmael is a beautiful example of man trying to save himself. But later in 21, many years later, God said, no, it's you, Sarah, that's going to have a child. And of course, within a year came Isaac. And here's the child of promise versus the child of human effort. And that's the purpose of this whole allegory. Now, it goes back to say the first girl was a slave girl, Hagar. The second girl was a wife, a free woman. The first girl, now here's where the problem, to me as an interpreter, I bet the Jews would have said, well, that's right. But when Paul got into it, they started croaking, I want you to know. Listen to this. One by a slave girl, one by a free woman. But the child of the slave girl was born in the ordinary course of human nature, just like every other child, by human intercourse. While the child of the free woman was born to fulfill the promise. Now here's the key thought. The promise of God. Sarah was barren. They had tried humanly many times and no child. God's going to do something to her barren womb. Now here's the idea. It's the promise that's the key. It's the promise that makes you a child. We're not heirs of Abraham by natural human descent, but we are heirs of Abraham by the faith promise. That's been the whole flow of this and the book of Romans. It's the key to verses 28 through 31. Now let me go back. This is spoken as an allegory, as a way of showing you a truth in another truth. Now Paul doesn't deny the historicity of Abraham's life, as Philo sometimes did. He just uses this to teach a deeper truth. For these women are two covenants, one coming from Mount Sinai, bearing children that are to be slaves, and that's where the Jews would have croaked, and Hagar means Mount Sinai in Arabia. Now here's the idea. He turned the tables. He made what was really the Arabs, the children of Ishmael, he made them the Jews in this. Oh, that just burnt them, I bet. And then he made Sarah's kids to be the kids of promise, not Judaism, but the kids of promise, the church. Oh, he turned the tables right here. Now, when it says Hagar means Mount Sinai in Arabia, some say this means it represents. I think that's the truth. Others say, no, it's etymologically connected, but we haven't been able, or geographically connected, and we haven't been able to find any connection like that. So, and corresponds to the present Jerusalem. For Jerusalem is in slavery with their children. What does that mean? Judaism. Now, friends, I want to say this to you, and I hope you hear it. I don't think Judaism, modern rabbinical understanding, which developed from Jamnia in AD 90 and into rabbinical Judaism in our day, they are not the spiritual inheritors of the Old Testament Scriptures. It's the church that are the true inheritors of the Old Testament Scriptures. They are the people of God. We are people of God by faith, grant you, not natural descendants of Abraham, but most of the Jews in Israel today aren't natural descendants. They're proselytes from Central Europe in the 9th century. Now, goes where it says, but the Jerusalem that is above is free. Now, here's the play on earthly Jerusalem and heavenly Jerusalem. Now, we see this several times in Hebrews 11:10, Hebrews 12:22, Hebrews 13:14, particularly in the book of the Revelation, Revelation 21:2 and 10. So heavenly Jerusalem stands for that city not made with human hands, eternal in the heaven. That city that Abraham looked for and never found. It has been found. It's New Jerusalem. It's the people of God, Old Testament and New. Now, notice where it says, verse 26, But the Jerusalem as above is free. She is our mother, for the Scripture says. Now he quotes Isaiah 54:1. And I must admit, it's in context, Isaiah 54:1 in the servant songs refers to the restoration of the city of Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. But in reality, this servant song, if you know this passage from Isaiah 40 through 66, also talks about New Jerusalem, particularly in chapters 65 and 66. So Paul says this has always been a scripture that points toward the eschatological kingdom, or the end-time culmination of the people of God in history. And so he quotes Isaiah 54 in a messianic, eschatological sense. Look at verse 28. Now we, brothers, like Isaac, are children born to fulfill the promise. He's making these Galatian Gentiles the same as Isaac. Boy, the Judaizers must have thrown up at this point, because they were trying to say, no, you can't be the sons of Isaac or Abraham until you be circumcised and offer a sacrifice and keep the food laws and on and on. Paul says, no, it's by faith. It has nothing to do with the Jewish law. Paul really depreciates the Jewish law in this book, not because the Jewish law is bad, because when human effort gets a hold of it and tries to be made right with God by their own effort, they so pervert the law becomes really a barrier instead of a door that it was meant to be in Revelation. Now, I agree it's a misinterpretation of the law that he's attacking here, because Jesus in Matthew 5:17 through 21 says the law is eternal. And even Paul in Romans 7 said the law is good and from God. It's the sinfulness of man that's perverted it. Now, notice where in verse 3 he says, drive off the slave girl. And I can almost hear Paul saying that you ought to drive off these Judaizers. Why? Because in verse 31, we are the children, not them. And that culminates his argument here. Next time we'll get into chapter 5, which begins to apply these theological truths of 3 and 4 to a very practical setting of the daily lives of the Galatians. I've enjoyed being with you. God bless you. And I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week.